If you haven't already, be sure to create your free Doug membership today by clicking on the Doug Hub in the left menu bar to access year-round community content, local meetups, and more. Please welcome veteran speaker and Microsoft MVP, Rami Mounla. Today, he will showcase premiering content in his session, How the Right Fusion Dev Balance Saved the Day. Please stick around after Rami's session for a live Q&A.
Hi guys, I am Rami Mounla. I am a solution architect at DXC, and today I'll be talking about Fusion development and how it might save the day. So let's start with our presentation. I first would like to give a big shout out to DynamicsCon, giving people like me the opportunity to go and present, even though I'm on the other side of the globe, but to be able to voice my opinion and then talk about some of the topics that I'm really passionate about in the Dynamics 365 space, specifically in customer engagement or the CE space. This presentation is something new that I'm doing this year. Through some of the projects that I've been working on with DXC, I've realized that Microsoft has been pushing a lot of people to do some low code, no code type of configuration, and then not really neglecting, but focusing more on the low code, no code as opposed to the pro code type of work. This presentation is about how you can actually still bring that development perspective back into the picture by what we call fusion development and being able to do something that would significantly improve the outcome of your project. So let's have a look at it. I'll start by giving you an overview of what we're going to do today. So the agenda is that I'll talk a little bit about myself, introduce myself, give you some information about my background, talk about some of the challenges that we had on the project that I was working on, and what were the options that we considered to move into a better space. We then considered fusion development. We came up with a process on how to do it. And finally, I'll share with you guys the results that we've seen in there. And then hopefully towards the end of the presentation, you guys will get the chance to ask us a few questions. I'll be available to answer those. If you want to know more about the process, or you've got a specific scenario that you want to discuss or some challenges in your organization around fusion development, please feel free to hold those questions till the end and let's have a chat about them. So first of all, who am I? I am Rami. I'm based in New Zealand. I am a MVP in the business application space, and I'm active in the community because I run a lot of events, user groups usually, but also larger conferences like the Global Power Platform Bootcamp and also the Microsoft Business Application Summit, which we do once a year in New Zealand. I am active talking in sort of international sessions as well, like DynamicsCon Live, which is a great opportunity for me to participate in that. A while ago, I wrote a little book about Dynamics 365, which has some ideas about how to do things. I tried as much as possible to keep that book as sort of generic as possible and to get it to be longing last in terms of sort of the topics that are in there. It is getting a little bit outdated, so hopefully it's time to write another version of that book, but hopefully it's still relevant. And a lot of the stuff that I talk about today are things that I've discussed in my book. And finally, as I mentioned, I do work for a company called DXC in New Zealand, Wellington specifically. So I have one message for you guys today, and that message is this. If you want to succeed, embrace fusion development. This is going to help you succeed in your work, and I'll demonstrate how we're going to do that. But first, let's make sure we all understand what is fusion development. So if you follow Scott Duro, he started this movement with the hashtag ProCode, NoCode, Unite. And what he meant by that is that it's not the ProCode team against the low-code team or vice versa. It's actually a harmony between the two. So if we work together, there's definitely a better outcome at the end of it. How did all of this start in terms of why we wanted to do fusion development? So on the project that I was working on in New Zealand, I've noticed that in terms of work distribution, we had a lot of time spent in the configuration space, but not enough in the customization space or in the data space. And that, in a way, makes sense because Microsoft is pushing for low-code, no-code platforms. The customer loves the low-code, no-code, and then they basically require it to be in there. But then we had a few challenges with this approach. Some of the challenges is that we were building some rules that are scattered everywhere across the platform. So it was difficult to maintain them. It was difficult to find where they are, to understand the code base, to decide, was it in Power Automate that we did that? Was it in a plugin? Was it in a legacy workflow? It was difficult to actually have that one location where all our rules are stored. It was also some of the complexity of the rules made it really difficult to implement using low code and no code. For example, and I'll show you a few screenshots of that. But if you're trying to do, for example, a lot of branching in Power Automate, that can very quickly become tedious to implement and also tedious to maintain. So we had all of those different difficulties. And then at the end of it was testing. Testing made it really difficult to go and figure out which Power Automate needed to be tested. How do we actually trigger that test? And because it's all integrated, you cannot test each one component more or less by itself. Then we had some challenges in that space. Now, we had some requirements that came from a customer, and at a high level, they wanted a centralized location to store the rules. They wanted hundreds, maybe thousands of rules to be created with lots of different criteria, and we needed to create those relatively quickly. And most importantly, they wanted all of that to be managed by the software development lifecycle, where they can use things like DevOps to actually deploy their changes from different locations. And they also had a lot of non-functional requirements, and they wanted to leverage software as a service rules engine as opposed to something that is on-premise, for example. So we were looking at third-party products that offer that capability. They wanted to make sure that there is a robust security around it so that the information is not exposed to the world, so that they can know what the rules are under the hood. They also wanted to have some robustness around it, around the security, around a disaster recovery. And they wanted to be relatively quick and fast. So in other terms, it needed to be close to the platform itself that we're using, which was Dynamics 365 at this stage. So let's have a look at some of the challenges that we currently had with the low code as we started with the approach. So we had a look at Power Automate. Again, when it came to branching, it was really difficult to actually have something that is easy to read, easy to maintain, and easy to implement. And then we moved on to having a look at the execution times. And as you can see, some of them took like multiple seconds to execute, 32 seconds, which in a way was not great experience. Power Automate is asynchronous by default, so that also introduced a little bit of delays and it affected the user experience. Most of the executions were relatively quick, so we're talking about 1 second or less. Some of them were in the milliseconds, and especially when there is no queries back to the platform. So if everything is happening in memory, like you're doing a transformation or you're just having a look at data coming in and then taking that data out without querying the database or using connectors, then it was relatively quick. So anyway, all of that gave us a good understanding of how Power Automate works and what are the limitations around it. Then we moved on to having a look at what are the different options that are available in the market. So we had a look at some competitive packages that out of the box provide rules management. And there are a few culprits in the market at the moment. We talked about Power Automate. There was also Note 52, which is a very robust, mature rules management that is built in Dynamics 365. Love that product. It's really good. And it does quite a lot of capabilities in terms of it works with model-driven, it works with portals, and it works with plugins. So those rules can be reused across different parts of the platform. Now, if we're moving away from Dynamics 365, in-rule is quite common in this area of the world. So it's a rules engine that sits outside of Dynamics 365, but provides out-of-the-box connectors to Dynamics 365, which was a great option. And then there's also FICO that is quite big in the financial industry. So a lot of the banks and the financial institutions like to use FICO, and they leverage it for rules management for Dynamics 365 as well. Now, each one of those had pros and cons. We talked a little bit about Power Automate being low code, fantastic, out of the box, part of the ecosystem and so on. But as I said, it was difficult to maintain, and it was not really a rules engine. You had to build all those rules from scratch. Node 52, as I mentioned, was mature, but it came at a cost. And also it generated code. So given that, Wellington, where I am based, is the political capital of New Zealand, a lot of our customers are in the government department, and they have very strict rules over what code goes into their platforms. And I could not, hand on heart, say, yep, this code is generated by Node 52, and on hand on heart, I can say that this is good code and quality code and secure code. So we had to know exactly what is going into the platform before we did it. We had a look at Unrule, as I said, out-of-the-box connectors to Dynamics 365. However, given that it's disconnected, it had that connectivity challenge that we had, which introduced some slowness and performance issues. FICO is more or less the same, leader in the financial market, but also hosted outside and came with some complex patterns that were not favorable. So we said, okay, let's consider building our own framework. Let's see how we can do that. So first of all, how do we build a framework? So the first thing that we had to do was do a feasibility study to see, is it going to save us some money? Is it going to work? And then we had a look at, we had to make sure that the customer was on board, for example, and then we acknowledged the limitations that are available part of that platform. So it's very important to be transparent with your customer, to go there and to tell them, this is what the platform is going to do. This is what it's not going to do. Are you guys on board? Once we had that, then we had to go to our team and make sure we've got the right combination in there of Fusion development in terms of the functional consultant, the technical consultant, the architects, the testers, that they were on board and they were willing to give this a go. Because there's no point going through Fusion development if you have 10 functional consultants and the bottleneck of one technical consultant who will not be able to cater for all the demands coming in. So we had to make sure we've got the right balance. We had to come up with some guiding principles in terms of how we're going to do it. And then finally, we had to make sure that the testing team was included in that journey and happy to do it. Sorry about the ordering, that went into a different order, but that's all good. I think the message was all there. So the next step that we had to do is to come up with the guiding principles. So what are we going to do and what are we not going to do? And what is the Northern Star? So that when we have to make a decision, we know exactly which one to make. So first of all, it needed to be easy to implement. What do I mean by that? Leverage as much as possible of the out-of-the-box capabilities coming from Dynamics 365 and Dataverse specifically. So we're talking about using the configuration schema, using the forms as they are without too much customization. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. So if the platform is really good at doing calculated columns, roll-up fields, or even some level of integration, just leverage those out-of-the-box capabilities. Don't implement them into your platform. Be very specific over what the platform does and it doesn't do. And that gave us good direction over where to invest our time to enhance the capabilities of the build that we're doing. By leveraging the out-of-the-box capability, that means you can offload more to the configuration team to build that capability. So you don't have to rely just on the technical side of things. And then the last point that I wanted to mention in here is that we made sure that it doesn't require any external infrastructure, because then that makes it much more difficult to build, to get approval to build, and then much more costly because you have different moving components. You have to think about disaster recovery, security, and so on. So we're like, just keep it out of the box within the platform as much as possible. The next part is that, all right, well, we're investing this time building that capability, that feature, that rules engine. How about we make it generic? Because then if it is generic, as a company, we can leverage that and use it somewhere else. So we came up with a new set of guiding principles saying that, first of all, it needs to be accessible within the platform, but also have external connectors so that if we want to reuse it in a different component, we can certainly do that. We want to make sure that it has no dependency on the customer's data, on the customer's schema. So it's generic. So when we're building it, it doesn't really know about the rules. It doesn't know about the data that is coming. It knows that at some stage, those will be generated and then fed into the platform. Think of it as, if you're doing development, the same concept as early binding and late binding. So when you do early binding, you basically know what your schema is going to look like at design time, at build time. However, if you do late binding, it's something that happens at runtime. And this is the same concept that we use, that we try to make sure that it's as generic as possible, so that we're not really coupling it with a customer or with an existing schema and so on. So the last one is more of a development capability following the solid principle. So if you've done development, you probably came across that. More specifically, two of the solid principles. The first one is O, closed for modification, open for extension. So the framework will be built. Yes, over time, we will have a roadmap. We will be able to enhance it, but it's built and it is things that it does and it doesn't do. However, if you wanted to do more, we don't build something specific within that platform just for that specific use case, which may never be used again, but we build it as an extension. Think of it as a plugin that we put into that platform and then we put in there. And then the last one is D, so dependent upon abstraction, not concretion, which means that, again, it's generic, it's not specific. So at runtime is where it goes, okay, well, there's an abstraction, I'm expecting a rule. I don't know what that rule actually looks like. I know there's data coming in. I don't really know what that data looks in. I know the signatures of them, but then when I actually trigger, then I will have the details that I need to be able to actually execute the changes. So some of the features that we've implemented is the capability to define rules, version those rules, give them effective dates so that they know when they start and when they end. And then everything is driven by data. Once the platform was built, then that's it. There's no further customization required. The rest of it was done using just pure data, out of the box, Dataverse data that we can move in using Azure DevOps and DevOps pipelines. It had lots of capabilities, such as retrieving data from the different locations. So basically generating key value pairs, doing one-to-many relationships, retrieving that data, feeding those into the rules engine. So feeding the data coming in as well as the rules into the rules engine. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, executing a capability, either updating a record, creating a record, triggering Power Automate, or triggering an action. So this is the nutshell of what we were trying to build. So what was the implementation vision? So the execution sequence was going to be as follows. We will start by an event triggering in Dynamics 365 that will prompt it to get the data that we need from that record, get the rules associated with it, feed them into the evaluation engine, and then finally come up with a list of executions that it needs to do, a list of actions that we've gotten there. So the color coding is in terms of what is configuration and what is customization. So the first one, the green one, is an out-of-the-box trigger. And then everything in yellow is basically something that we can do in configuration. The core of the engine and some of the custom actions can be something done in customization. But once those are done, then the rest will turn into configuration. So I'll quickly talk about the code details and the implementation details. So we had the ERD entity relationship diagram where we had an evaluation group. That group had a collection of rules, and that rules have a collection of rule items. So basically, those are the things that define what is required. When an event happens, what are the rules associated with it? And then part of the evaluation group, we have a payload. The payload is actually, with the payload items, goes into the system and goes, all right, I need this data from here, this data from here, this data from here. I'll marry it with those groups rules in there, and then push them into the evaluation engine and then get the results at the end. In terms of the different sort of designs behind the scenes, we used a plugin and a synchronous plugin. I'll talk a little bit about why we used the synchronous plugin to do that. But then we layered it. So we had the entry of the plugin, we had the core business logic of the plugin, and then we had the data access of that plugin. Each one of those was actually a separate project within Visual Studio. And then that gives us the flexibility of calling custom actions to call that engine, or APIs to call that engine. Or if we wanted to do unit testing, we could do that as well, call the engine straight away and stop using the plugin itself, but call the business logic, mock, for example, the data layer, or get the data from Dynamics 365 and feed it some mock rules or whatever it is. So we had that full flexibility and the power of years of maturity in the customization side to leverage and to use to our advantage, especially in quality assurance and in the testing space. So at a high level, the class diagrams was to have the payload generator, the actual engine, and the engine plugin, each one of those as separate projects in Visual Studio. So in other terms, it looked something like that. This was an early version. We did that. You will notice that some of the icons actually have a shared project associated with them, which means that the result all merges into one DLL. And we deployed that one DLL into our system. But then later version of the system actually used individual libraries or DLLs. And that meant that we had the plugin one, we had the core engine one, we had the payload generator one, we have the unit testing. And we used the latest feature released part of Dynamics 365, which is dependent assemblies, where you can put all those assemblies into one NuGet package and deploy it as a plugin. So the sequence at a high level looks something like that. The plugin would trigger, it would go get some information from Dataverse, and that's for the data that it needs, as well as the rules that it needs. It then goes and generates the payload. It then calls the engine core itself, and then it decides what are the actions that it needs to do. Relatively simple, relatively straightforward. This is what you would expect from the rules engine. Now, all of that is in terms of the customization itself. Now, how about the authoring? How to create those new rules? How will we make sure that they are in the same location? As I said, we leveraged out-of-the-box schema and forms coming from Dynamics 365. And in order to do that, we just set it up the way you would configure a normal form. We had the groups, we had the rules associated with it, we had the elements. Now, it did come with a few challenges. It's not as mature as what you would see in North 52. It's not as mature as what you would see in Power Pages, for example, where it knows about existing forms. It knows about existing sections. It knows about existing attributes or option sets and all of that. But instead, there was a little bit of manual work. So we had to, for example, the entity type it in. It was just text that was entered at that stage. So we needed a little bit of understanding of the logic behind it. An attribute, for example, if we wanted to update an attribute as an action, then what we had to do is type in what that attribute name is and then put in the results in there. So there was a little bit of manual work, if you want, and a little bit of limitations associated with that. All right, so what I'm going to do next is switch into a demo environment and then show you what the rule authoring experience looks like, and also show you what does the execution of those rules look like. Okay, so now I have my instance of Dynamics 365 in my organization tenancy, which is DXC. And I've got a special app that I've created for the evaluation engine. And within there, you can see that there is the evaluation group that we talked about, the rules, the items, the payload templates, and the payload items associated with it. So let's have a look at how do we author them. So we go to an evaluation group. The evaluation group will have the actual the groups in them. So let's open one of them. They will know exactly when to trigger, so they will have the entity name. As I said, we had to type this, which is a little bit error prone, but that was something that we were willing to compromise, maybe add it into the roadmap on how we can improve it overall later. And then each one of those groups had a collection of rules, and within a rule, it had what are the actions that I need to execute if that rule passes, and also what are the rule items associated with it. So for example, we had to look at a specific element. So this is the DXC claim cost is greater than, so we had a drop down in here of all the possible comparison, 1,000. So by getting the payload, getting a DXC claim cost, and then looking at the value associated with it, we can do a comparison and say, all right, well, it's less than 1,000, then this rule passes, and so on. Let me show you something that might have been a little bit more challenging. So if we had an application processing, for example, and then that had a collection of rules associated with it. So if I open this one, for example, application with no match, you will notice that within the rule items, we had things like GUIDs. Again, not the best experience. This was copied and pasted into that value, into that field in here. But basically, we said there is a payload element called application type that needs to be equal to that lookup value in there. So again, not perfect in terms of authoring. We needed to know a little bit about the schema and the platform, but most of our consultants were more than comfortable doing that. And then finally, the payload, which is basically where do we get the data from, is done using those payload templates and the items. And basically all they said is that, all right, I'm on that record, get me the DXC claim cost, get me the DXC customer type, and then put them into one JSON object that we then feed into the platform. So that was relatively straightforward. Again, a little bit of manual understanding, but our consultants were comfortable doing that. So let's put it in action. Let's have a look at what it might look like. So I've got a collection of cases that I've created in here. The moment I trigger the evaluation engine on it, it will go and have a look at the customer type. Is it a normal customer, regular, or premium? And then the claim cost associated with them. If it's under 5,000, then it automatically gets approved. If it's over 10,000 for a premium customer, then it needs to go through manual approval. And the way I trigger it is by saying evaluate yes or no. This was actually the triggering point of the plugin. So if I save that record, then you will see it takes a little bit longer because it's actually calling the plugin. It's waking up, it's doing its magic, and it comes back with it has been evaluated and it's approved, and that record is inactive now. So it does all of that part of the framework. Now let's go to a higher claim for $12,000, for example. And then if I evaluate that and I click on the save button, then again, the plugin will trigger and it will say, no, this is over the threshold. I know that there is a rule that says if that happens, then I need to go into manual mode, and then it goes into manual mode. A bit anticlimactic in terms of the final result, but there was a little bit of delay in there, and I want to spend some time talking about that. So let's have a look. I'll carry on with my presentation now, and let's have a look at the details with what's happening behind the scenes and how our testing goes. Okay, now that we had a look at the demo, let's move on and have a look at how did the testing results happen and what were the results that we got out of it. So we did some unit testing. The good thing is that, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, is that we can define how we get access to it and what type of testing we can do. So we did a lot of pure offline disconnected testing just to make sure that our rules are robust and correct. So we could run, thousands of rules, and each one of them would take milliseconds to execute. So we can do a test that would go through 100. I think we had 1,300 rules with, even a fold of 3 times that, so 3,000, 4,000 rule elements that could execute within a couple of seconds. And that was phenomenal in terms of the amount of testing we can do in a little time. And then we focus on performance testing. So as you notice, it took a little bit longer to execute. So going back to that sequence diagram of all the different things that we could do, we looked at each single element of that sequence diagram, and then we stress tested it. We did 1,200 executions within an hour to see how the results would look like. And then basically the results that we got is that anything that has a query to the database takes around 100 milliseconds, maybe less. Anything that executes in memory takes less than a millisecond, and that was phenomenal. So the engine itself was super performant, where because everything is in memory and it's using cloud computing power, it was super fast to actually execute that. And obviously the last trigger, which is updating records, creating records, took a little bit longer. But basically we had sub-second executions, which in performance was really difficult to beat. So coming to the conclusion of my presentation, I just wanted to tell you what the results were and how we actually ended up at the end. So remember at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the work distribution where we had lots of configuration done upfront and very little customization, very little data. That changed into a graph that looked more like that, where there was more or less an even distribution with maybe a little bit more configuration done, but there was some customization done that overall sped up our delivery significantly faster. So where are we at today? So first of all, in terms of complexity, we've reduced it significantly because, as I said, the rules are data-driven and they are located in one location, not scattered around, and they're easy to test, easy to maintain, easy to debug, and so on. Given that it's data-driven, then the analysts did a lot of the work of configuring those rules. There was absolutely no need for customization moving forward once the engine was done. It was super fast to deliver. It was easy to build and maintain, as we mentioned. And in terms of test coverage, we had high coverage because we could do all of those sort of years of maturity in the unit testing space to actually get the most out of it and give assurance to our customer that we're doing the right thing in terms of sensitive rules. We had much better work distribution, as I mentioned. The amount of work that was done by our very capable technical team, and then they did what they're best at, and then they built that thing. So everybody was doing what they do best, basically. We had a much lower defect rate, which was also good. And because people were doing things that they're passionate about, they were more engaged. There's nothing better than giving a developer a little bit of C# code, some unit testing to do where they can actually shine and show their skills, as opposed to ask them to point and click and then configure a Power Automate, for example. So just some final words of advice. So it's really important to understand sort of how it would work for you. I think take this advice and then see how you can actually leverage to your advantage. So wherever you can, leverage Fusion development. I think this is really important to give a good balance in your project. And I think a lot of it came from my perspective in terms of just understanding what is the platform capable of and what is it not so good at. So again, Microsoft will probably focus too much on the low-code, no-code configuration, but there's also a lot of investment done in the customization space. So they don't shy away from that. They still say it's fully supported. We're actually investing in it. We're actually improving it. So let's not ignore it and say, customization, no, this is not good. No, actually understand what the platform capabilities are and how you can leverage those to the fullest to your advantage. If it has plugins, maybe I should be using plugins, right? And then just think about the team constitution that you've got. So as I said, we had technical consultant, we had functional consultant. The technical consultant love writing code, right? And to be honest, I actually was part of that team that built that framework. I came up with the concept, and then I came up with the design, and then I built a section of it. I left a lot of it for the rest of the team to have some fun as well. And then I delegated that to the people that I knew were capable to implement it. And given that I am a .NET developer by training, and this is how I started my career back in the days, and I still do that, and I still love doing that, there was nothing more satisfying than writing a little bit of code that saved us hours and hours of implementation details, right? To the point where I usually commute to work by train, and my commute is about 45 minutes. Those were the most productive 45 minutes of the day because I'm disconnected. I've got years of experience in .NET. I actually didn't need to Google any of that or to go and figure out how to do it. I knew how to do it. And all I wanted is just some quiet time to sit down and do it. And our trains in New Zealand are, luckily enough, comfortable to do that work while we're going during those 45 minutes. And yeah, that was like, I was sad the moment I was arriving at the train station, or the days where I was driving rather than taking the train. I was like, I'm not going to do my usual development. So I think cater for the diversity that you've got in your team, and also try to nurture their passion. Try to work with them, and then make sure that they're engaged, they're getting the most of what they love working with and how they like to improve. And then sometimes the customer will come back and say, oh, we want to do that, and then the team will go, yeah, okay, we'll do whatever the customer will say. Challenge that. Always go back and say, hey, have we thought about all the different alternatives? Maybe not Fusion development, but consider, are there any third-party products that can do that? And anybody in the team, regardless of how senior or how junior they are, can contribute to that conversation and give you a little bit of direction. I'm usually amazed by some of the newbies, how passionate they are, and they do a lot of research, and then they go and say, hey, have we tried that? How about we try this alternative instead? And that could save us some time. Embrace that, look at it, consider it, and then give them some feedback. And then same thing, like don't just go with status quo, question it. Again, this is the common era of low code, no code. People will push you to do that. The customer will say, we want this or nothing. Challenge that. and then go back and say, well, I'm sure that we can do better just by introducing a little of customization. And those are the advantages. We're much faster, lower defects. We can actually do unit testing across the entire platform. And then we know exactly what is going to go in because we wrote that code, and then we can guarantee performance is going to be good because we've done a lot of stress testing and things like that. Mileage might vary, so whatever works for you, but just take those as guiding principles. Consider what is the art of possible, leverage the platform to its fullest, and most importantly, just have fun doing all of that. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for sticking around. I am going to be around to answer some questions. Again, if you're venturing into Fusion development, if you want to know more about the platform itself that we've built, feel free to ask those questions. I am considering actually turning that into a open source project, given that it's agnostic and it doesn't know about any of our customers and not specific to the company that I work for. But give me that feedback. If you twist my arm and tell me that you really want it, then maybe I'll consider doing that. I haven't done it at the moment, but more than happy to consider it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, DynamicsCon, for giving me the opportunity to share my ideas about Fusion development. And with that, I am really glad to be part of it. And if you have any questions, I'm available. Please feel free to ask me anything.